we welcome sisters, associates, and friends, all our sisters here at the Villa, and so many people who have heard Mary this afternoon who really commented on how great she is. So we know we're in for a great treat tonight. And we also welcome those who will eventually see this video. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, are honored to sponsor and host this event along with the United States Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And as I said, we are all in for a real treat tonight as we listen to Sister Mary McGlone. I've heard Mary at some other events with the Federation leadership meetings, and I think you will totally enjoy her stories, her humor, and her wonderful way of connecting our past and present history.
Thank you very much, and it really is a delight to be here. Greeting sisters, mostly it looks like Sisters of St. Joseph from Philadelphia, but we also have one of my graduate school colleagues, a Sister of Mercy. So this is an ecumenical gathering. And I think the Sisters of St. Joseph will recognize a lot of the language that I use. We're looking at who we have been, and it's sort of coming, we recognize this from our maxims. What are we called to? In the manifestation of zeal characteristic of your very humble vocation. Imitate the fervor of the most zealous. Embrace in desire the salvation of the whole world. This will bring you to wish to do everything, to suffer everything, and to undertake everything for the advancement of the glory of God and the salvation of the dear neighbor. That's all we're called to. Here's what our sisters did. The journey from France to the United States. Actually, I took their takeoff points from, today we're talking not about the first 6, but about the next 2. A name many of you will know, Sister St. John Fournier. And her companion and cousin, Sister Celestine Pommerel. The 2 who learned to teach the deaf so that they could come and be major superiors in the United States. Now, what were they coming to? When they came to the United States, it had been a country for almost 50 years. The first French monarch was seated in the year 486. There's a little difference in our histories. Just 1,290 years. The Church of France had had martyrs from the 2nd century. The Church in the United States, well, we had our first bishop elected in 1789. Now this is a new picture for us that I happened to find in the Carondelet archives last week. We have here the cousin travelers, Celestine Pommerel and St. John Fournier. Much younger picture than we've seen before, but we did our best investigations to think, and we decided that's who it really is. So on Friday, April 7th, they departed, of 1837, they departed from Lyon for Brest. That's a trip of about 600 miles. Then on June 5th, they got on the boat, went to Martinique, got to Havana by the end of July, and spent 17 days at the port of Havana while they waited for the French consul for some reason that he had to be on the boat. Now, those of you who've read Mother St. John's letter, I just love it. She says, a fine religious life. Each night they took us in to go out to dinner in Havana. And these 2 were young. They were like 24 years old, you know. So what were they ready for? What were they thinking they were coming to? They had an advantage over the 6 who went the year before. They had heard from them. They had gotten letters. They had probably consulted, certainly, Mother St. John Fontbonne talked to them about what to expect. We didn't know it would be like this, but go be ready for that, you know? There were some things that they knew. Oh, there are those dates. They knew that they might have to disguise the habit in public. Probably not in St. Louis. It seems, you know, that's part of the odd part of our story. There were a lot of sisters in St. Louis already. The Religious of the Sacred Heart were there from France. The Visitandines were there. There were Ursulines, maybe not yet Ursulines, Sisters of Loretto, the Kentucky group. So, frankly, Bishop Rosati did not need more sisters. When the Religious of the Sacred Heart came, he sent them out to St. Charles, and then there were some in Florissant. Our getting there was a very odd thing. So they knew they might. There were sisters around St. Louis. Oh, the Sisters of Charity as well, with whom they stayed and whose house they inherited. The wrong way. They knew that learning English was a necessity. Now these two probably had a bit of an advantage over the ones who went before them because they had gone to school to learn to teach the deaf. That meant they had entered into a different kind of world. The people who do not have hearing and speech have to think and communicate differently. Now, deaf education really got its start in France. There was a priest in Paris who spent time among the deaf and watched how they invented their own means of communication. You know, just like little kids. Twins will babble and have their own language. Well, the deaf could do this with one another, but not in a systematic way. People who knew each other could communicate, but from a stranger, no. So this priest watched and essentially entered into their culture, the culture of the deaf, in order to learn what they were doing, and then systematized it and put sign language into a French grammar way of doing things, and began the whole business of universal signing for the deaf so that the deaf could communicate. So our sisters learned this. And in learning that, they didn't only learn deaf education, but they learned a bit of missiology about how you have to be among the people and know the people and their ways of doing things before you teach them what you have to teach. So they knew that learning English was a necessity, and by golly, English is not an easy language to learn. It's not as wasteful as French. I always say French is very wasteful. All these letters that you don't pronounce. But English is very hard. They knew, they hadn't experienced it yet, but they knew they were going to primitive conditions. In other presentations, I often show the Mother House at Lyon, which is a beautiful 4-story building right next door to the Carthusian monastery on what they called the hill that prays in Lyon. And they went from that to a log cabin that the Sisters of Charity had abandoned. Primitive conditions. They knew by then that they weren't going to be meeting Indians in St. Louis, even though that was the Countess's big idea before they went. The woman who funded their trip wanted them to be missionaries to the Indians. Well, that wasn't part of the basic St. Louis scene. Had they ever seen people of African descent? We don't know. But when the Lepuy sisters, about 15, 20 years later, went to St. Augustine, they saw their first people from African descent on the boat going from New York down the coast to St. Augustine. They may have never seen black people before. Did they know about the history of slavery in the area? How did these women from Lyon put together the idea that standing on the bluff at Crondelet, looking across the river to where Cahokia was, the other place that our sisters were, on this side of the river, somebody could be a slave, and on that side of the river, they were free. And what makes it, how on earth can you decide who can be owned by someone? This wasn't part of their culture, this wasn't part of their background, but it was going on. They could have seen slaves being sold down near the old cathedral. Did they know about the tensions in the community that had been happening? Troubles between the pastor at Crondelet and the sisters. That poor Delphine Fontbonne. Now, the talk that I did at Crondelet on Monday was about Mother Delphine, missionary and medic. And one of the things that I said during that was she was named superior of the small group, the three sisters, who went to Crondelet. She was 23 years old and had had vows for 1 full year. One of the sisters with her was 9 years her senior, and the other was a novice. And here is this young person trying to figure out what it means to be a superior. On the travels, her older sister, Fabroni, had been the superior, 9 years older than she. That makes sense. Why was she named the superior? Because her name was Fontbonne, maybe? Doesn't seem to be much of another reason. Maybe Father Jacques Fontbonne, their brother, promised that he'd help, and a fine help he was. Did they know about the community tensions? They probably didn't know about the lack of deaf children in the area. These two, I mean, just imagine. I mean, nobody in religious life could ever imagine anything like this. Being prepared for one ministry and then being told you've got another. Well, they get there and there aren't any deaf kids. The nearest child was 60 miles away in a town called Potosi. And because that child was rather an abandoned child, they called her Potosi because they didn't even know what her name was. Within about a year, a few more deaf children came, and Bishop Rosati was able to get the state legislature to appropriate funds to teach them. That was $2,000 if the children studied for more than 6 months, which meant sort of if you're making a go of this. But $2,000, that was money. That's why that log cabin got a new facade, and they started building more buildings around it. We don't know if they knew those things. What did they know about this new contentious country that was calling itself the United States? How united was it at that time? Think about what they were facing. So they go. And there's the basic question. One that probably we all have to face again. Who are we now? You know, they were suddenly outside of their own culture, outside of their own language area. Who are we? Who are we supposed to be? We're ready to teach the deaf and those children aren't here. We've been good teachers in academies and we're in the midst of a very primitive kind of people. And I think, you know, the stories about Delphine Fontbonne in the early years are that she was rigid. What do you hold on to when you're thrown into a situation like that? The rule. That'll tell me who I am. The rule. was almost as long as traveling all the way across France to go from Lyon to Brest, where they got on the boat. Now, these women, Mother St. John Fournier was different. The rest of them had entered the Sisters of St. Joseph of Lyon with every intention of being Sisters of St. Joseph of Lyon, who served around in the Archdiocese of Lyon. Some of them went far away, like 90 miles to Chambéry, and opened a new congregation, or to Annecy, or even over the mountains to Italy. Nobody entered thinking they were going to be missionaries. Mother St. John Fontbonne, we have no indication that she thought of mission outside of France. But suddenly they were there. Now, Mother St. John Fournier is a different story. I think you all know that she entered a community that was a contemplative community. Apparently, the rumor mill was very strong, and she heard that the Countess Rochacquelin was going to send Sisters of St. Joseph as missionaries to the United States. And so, having made perpetual vows in this other community, she comes and presents herself to Mother St. John, and she shows up one day, and a week later she gets the habit. But then the novitiate lasted a lot longer than she expected. But she went and studied. What's this mission story about? Where are we? Well, they're in America, the New World. The first Anglo missioners, or missioners in what became the original colonies, the first one was Andrew White, a Jesuit, who went to Maryland as part of the Maryland colony. Now, Maryland, remember from your history, was going to be the free place for Catholics, right? So we've got toleration here. Toleration means you can't diss anybody. Any person who, in a reproachful manner, these are not typos, that's the way it's written, would call another a heretic, schismatic, idolater, Puritan, popish priest, Jesuit, Jesuited papist, Lutheran, or any other name or term in a reproachful manner relating to the matter of religion shall for every such offense forfeit and lose the sum of 10 shillings sterling. So you can't call people names. Blasphemy is a little worse. Whatsoever person or persons in this province blaspheme God, deny our Savior Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, or shall deny the Holy Trinity, shall be punished with death and confiscation or forfeiture of all his or her lands and goods. So toleration had its limits. The United States Church, experimental models, what were they doing? In the beginning, the United States, when we became a nation, we were a mission territory. It had been under European rule. What became the United States, the British colonies, had been under the Archbishop of Westminster, the Catholic bishop from England, the Catholic Archbishop of England. So in 1789, within about a month of the time that the Constitution was ratified, John Carroll was elected as the bishop by his priests. The very first bishop elected in the United States. Also the last bishop elected by the priests in the United States. Another one, figuring out what was going on in this new country is over here. John England of Charleston. Now he was named Bishop of Charleston while he was still a very young priest, under 30 I believe, in Ireland, but named as the Bishop of Charleston. When he was consecrated bishop, he refused to take the oath of fealty to the king because he said, I am not going to be in British territory. Then he gets to the United States and he writes a constitution for the diocese, which includes houses, almost like the Congress, giving voice to the priests and the laity. He had great ideas, and they didn't go far. He also commissioned lay people to lead services in the absence of a priest. How things have changed, no? But they were figuring out how to be church in this new world, and it was a different situation. So here we get our missionaries. When I had not seen this picture until about a week ago, but we do have a traditional picture of Mother Fabroni Fontbonne and Fabroni Chapillon. And our archivist, recently deceased, used to say it's very unusual to find a picture of two sisters together. Well, it's beginning to look like they had no fear of friendship. Fabroni and Fabroni are together, Delphine and St. John Fournier are together. So what was St. John Fournier's experience? By 1838, they had 4 deaf girls beginning studies at Carondelet. It took her a while to make vows, and they weren't sure they wanted her to because her health was rather fragile. And after she made vows, she spent a year getting better. Carondelet's conditions were such that you didn't get stronger there. So she lived with the religious of the Sacred Heart and studied English. My guess is she was a very fine linguist, probably just kind of a natural at languages. Then in 1839 to 45, she taught at Carondelet. In 1845, she opened the next mission of the Sisters of St. Joseph in the United States. And that was a school for colored children in the city of St. Louis that was sponsored by Father Paris, who became, I think he must have been what they called the ecclesiastical superior, the right hand to the community there, a Frenchman. But he wanted this school, and so he asked our sisters to take it. And Mother St. John and 2 others opened this school in the city of St. Louis, probably near the old cathedral area. All went swimmingly for a while until the local populace didn't want it anymore and threatened them, and eventually Bishop Kenrick decided that it had to be closed. So from there, she went to the boys' orphanage in St. Louis. This was the time when the Sisters of Charity were becoming unified with the Daughters of Charity in France. And according to their rule, they could not care for boys. This was one of the things that made us a hot ticket. We could take care of boys. You know, what was our mission? Anything of which a woman is capable, to serve the dear neighbor. So she did that. And then, you know, we're on the frontier in the United States. There's not a lot known of what's further on. Everybody is gung-ho for this frontier, so what do? Go east, sisters, go east! And why? Well, it all has to do with the names of the bishops. Peter Richard Kenrick was by then the Archbishop of St. Louis, and Francis Patrick Kenrick was the Bishop of Philadelphia. Now here comes one of my fun facts to know and tell. Francis Patrick was 9 years older than Peter Richard, the 2 bishops. Francis Patrick was here. Kenrick of St. Louis was an archbishop. St. Louis was the 3rd archdiocese in the United States. The first was Baltimore with John Carroll. What do you think was the second?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. That's a very good guess. It's wrong. Another try?
New York.
New York is another, that makes a lot of sense, and it's wrong.
Newark.
Newark, I never even thought of that. I think that's a little more modern times in Cardinals or something, I don't know. Boston? Boston, that's a great idea. It's wrong. What? Virginia? Virginia? That might be, yeah. Maryland? Yeah, no. New Orleans, that's a very good idea. New Orleans, that would make sense, but it wasn't. Kentucky is another one that not everybody would think of. But there was a lot more Catholic activity in Kentucky at the time. But it's not that. Kansas City is still not an archdiocese. Kansas City, Kansas is an archdiocese. Oregon. You did it just the way I knew you would. Oregon. Now, this is going to, it could be shocking, but there was some under-the-table negotiations going on in Rome. In Rome. And somehow the people in Rome were not informed of all of the absolutely true facts. And the territory of Oregon was made an archdiocese with about 4 priests. Some of it may have had to do with trying to establish the line of demarcation between Canadian and US territory. But Oregon was the second archdiocese, St. Louis the third. This plays into our history as Sisters of St. Joseph in part because not a whole lot of people who lived in this part of the country thought the way you all were thinking tonight. The second archdiocese should be Boston, it should be Philadelphia, it should be New York. And then the third one was St. Louis, where the young Kenrick is. What's the story here? And so the young Kenrick was not always the most popular with everybody, whose noses were a little out of joint. So that years later, when the young Kenrick is inviting Sisters of St. Joseph to consider being a congregation, some of these Eastern bishops are not real excited about sending their superiors out to this meeting to talk about that. The meeting was on May 2nd, 1860. But Philadelphia did not attend, Toronto did not attend, New York did not attend, Buffalo did not attend, Wheeling did send somebody with the word that they were not going to be a part of it. The only ones who were allowed to participate in that meeting and join in this movement to create a congregation of Sisters of St. Joseph of pontifical right in the United States, not tied to one diocese, were the sisters in St. Louis, the sisters in Mississippi, the sisters in St. Paul, and the sisters in Albany. Now you may note that there was only one eastern city that I mentioned. That was a place where the man, soon to be the first cardinal of the United States, had about 4 Sisters of St. Joseph serving, and he was promised more in June. So I think that may have had something to do with his saying, oh yeah, you can go to that meeting at Carondelet. Anyway, so she's taught in these places, and then the first mission outside of the Archdiocese of St. Louis in Philadelphia, Mother St. John Fournier is made the superior. Missionary linguist. There are her missions until she comes here. You recognize the picture? St. John's Orphanage. She was prepared just about as much as would have been possible. So what is going on here? These sisters are in a country that they really had no mental structure to imagine. We know this. You could probably say it with me. The Declaration of Independence was as foreign to their ears as English was. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another and assume among the powers of the earth separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requests that they requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You know the rest? Yeah. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was, well, one of our historians, U.S. historians, calls the United States a nation with the soul of a church. Now think about the difference between France and the United States at this time. The U.S. Revolution bases itself on the inalienable rights given us by the Creator. The French Revolution is purposely and as totally godless as it can be. So the sisters don't know what to do with this. The revolution in France was an awful thing. We had martyrs in it. They were trying to do away with religion entirely. And the revolution here was based on what they said God wants. You know, these are the rights we're given by the Creator. Then when we get to the Constitution, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for our common defense, promote the general welfare. Wouldn't that be nice if that was really what we wanted? Sounds a little like common good, doesn't it? And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Who is this we the people? Well, all of a sudden we're bringing together a lot of people who didn't have the same mother tongue, who didn't have the same traditions. This we the people, you know, the sisters came from homogeneous France. Everybody spoke French, maybe a little bit different accent. They came from a society that was well accustomed to having classes. And nobody thought twice about it. You know, the nobility is different. The clergy is different. The ordinary people, the merchants, that's just the way it is. If you read Mother Theodore Guerin, writing her letters from St. Mary's of the Woods in Indiana, she's dumbfounded by these American postulants that are coming. She says, I sat down at the table and they had the washerwoman at the table with us. And when I said something, you'd have thought that I was a heretic. The way these girls reacted, I don't know what they're thinking. You know, a different mindset is what they're dealing with here. So from homogeneous France, they come to St. Louis, and if they decided to go beyond Carondelet, if they wanted to go downtown to Mass on a Sunday, they could choose. Were they going to have the sermon in English, or go to the other church, or the other time of Mass when the sermon was in French, or might they go to the German one? Because all of those were being offered regularly in the city of St. Louis. At the same time, this we the people are not all together. Did you know that you're famous for the race riots of the 1830s and 40s that started over who could be on a merry-go-round, or the horses, or something like that? White citizens smashing one account that I read said smashing black citizens and their homes and taverns. Those arrested were more victims than perpetrators. In 1838, given this kind of discord, the Pennsylvania Constitution rescinded the right to vote from blacks. They had had it before. Here, the population of African Americans was growing along with the population of abolitionists. Who do you trust? Mobs set fire to Pennsylvania Hall, which was an abolitionist center that they had just completed. The firefighters came right away and doused all the houses around Pennsylvania Hall and let it burn. It was the abolitionists. Who was causing all of this? The lowest people on the social ladder. You know, some were saying it was all the Irish. Now, some of them probably. But this idea of all men created equal was a project. It was a dream. It was something to be worked out. It was their ideal, though. And that's the sacred scripture of the United States idealism. Logically, and they were very logical, this meant that you had to have freedom of religion. If everybody is created equal, you've got to have liberty of cult. Nobody can dictate what somebody else must believe. And so the non-establishment clause of our Constitution was a national law. Interestingly, it wasn't local. States could have an established religion. The nation just couldn't. And the other interesting thing was that I think both Catholics and Protestants agreed that error has no rights. And so an atheist wouldn't be tolerated. So we get here our great symbol of the mother of the exiles. These were great ideas and great symbols. The Statue of Liberty was planned as a gift from France to the United States at the conclusion of the Civil War. The broken chains at her feet are supposed to symbolize the freedom, no more slavery. And what does she say? Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your
Send needs of the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Our sacred writ, our beliefs that we're still struggling. You know, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Or the other side of the Rio Grande.
Yeah.
The Immigrants. Between 1820 and 1840, approximately 260,000 Irish immigrated to the United States. So 250,000 in 20 years. As a result of the potato famine, which was at its height between 1846 and 1851, so that's just the period when Mother St. John Fournier is getting established here, more than 1 million came. That's only from Ireland, only in those 5 years. The number of German immigrants grew kind of with the Irish, with approximately 1.5 million before the Civil War, and a total of 3.5 million by 1900. Most of the Germans were not quite as poor as the Irish, and many of them moved beyond the cities and got out to the Midwest and became farmers and so on. The Italians who came, they say a full third of the Italians returned to Italy, finding either that the place was inhospitable or they had gotten here, they had earned what they needed, and they went back. You know, and this does not count those who went back to get their family and return. But many Italians, proportionately many more, returned to their homeland to stay than did the Irish or the Germans. There's a One of our primo historians of U.S. Catholic history, Jay Dolan, talks about the fact that literacy was increasing in Ireland. Now, this was with some problems because they were forcing children into Protestant schools. But at the same time, as that happened, it was opening young people's ideas and dreams. And the majority of Irish immigrants after the Civil War were young, single men and women under 35 years of age. And that would include some who became our sisters. This is Sister Mary Michael Dooley. Now, I discovered her, I met her, memory, in Buffalo a few months ago. Mary Michael grew up in a poor Irish family and saw that they needed to immigrate. And Mary Michael came to Buffalo and eventually entered the community. And one day she wrote a poem. And this is part of her poem. One day I went to search my trunk for something in great haste, for I was very busy and I had no time to waste. I found a little package, 'twas folded up with care. In haste, I opened it up, and from it fell a lock of silvery hair. Just one small lock, one silvery lock of my dear father's hair. I fondly pressed it to my lips. The warm tears fell fast as I thought about the present and gazed back to the past. When last I looked on Father's brow, no silvery threads were there, but a fresh round face and rosy cheeks and wavy nut brown hair. Then she talks about saying goodbye to her family, waving from the train, going to the docks and finding that the boat wasn't ready to go. And so she and some companions wandered a bit. We walked around each day to view the scenery so grand, which made us feel so keenly to leave our native land. And hear what's going on in the mind of the immigrant. For indeed there was in Ireland enough and much to spare, but none to see that her children we should get a rightful share. And so we had to go away to seek in other lands for what we could easily have at home, but for the spoiler's hands. And thus we spent the last few days that in Erin we could stay, and soon the good ship did arrive to take us all away. We got on board that bounding ark, a goodly number too, just 1,100 souls, besides the ship's own crew. And when we were all safe on board, although the tears did blind, we turned and gazed on Erin's shore, the land we left behind. At length the sun began to sink into the ocean blue. With its last rays on land we gazed, but soon it was lost to view. Then she arrives in New York. And soon I got employment too, for which I was paid well, and many a letter I sent home of my success to tell, and many an answer I received to say that all were well. But when I thought of friends and home, the intrusive tears would spring, for I longed to see the green fields and woods, to hear the wild birds sing. Now, I skipped over the part where she said she made a visit to the church, of course, when she first arrived in New York, and felt the Lord calling. Then, heedful to the warning voice I heard down in my heart, I then renewed the promise, from all the world to part. Thus 3 years passed, and then I wrote and told my parents all of how I'd listened to God's call, and to God's voice, and would obey the call. The answer to me soon did come, and which my heart did cheer. And it has been a comfort to me for many a year, saying, dear child, will you our blessing give with all a parent's heart, and thank the Lord who gave you grace to choose the better part. I love this. Consider well, do not in haste. Then if you enter, stay. Nor turn you to the right or left, but walk the narrow way. Nor heed you what a foolish world may think of you or say, and we will try and not feel sad, though we'll see your face no more. For our holy faith assures us we will meet on the eternal shore. I then to the convent did apply and received the answer, come. I was happy now to live for God, for whose sake I left my friends and home. And gladly to the orphan child I will my service give, and teach them all the best I know, in God's fear and love to live. So I just think that's a wonderful introduction or insight into how many of our sisters were immigrants. How many immigrants? What were they looking for? You know, we don't hear, when we hear the stories on TV about the immigrants, how hard it was to leave home. What it was like as the home village went out of sight. What was going on? What were the people, the leader types, thinking about the United States, about the Catholic Church? 1832, Pope Gregory XVI, in his encyclical Miraribus, condemned separation of church and state. So now that kind of puts you in a quandary, doesn't it? If you're one of the bishops of the United States, there were about 12 of them by then, I think. It's not an acceptable way to live. On the other side, we have somebody like this handsome man, E.P. Holbert, who wrote essays on human rights and their political guarantees. And he explains the other side of that situation, saying, the theocracy of Roman and the democracy of America, being utterly incompatible, have no other way to peace but by entire separation. Church and state in Europe, in the United States, how are people going to understand it? How are we going to work through it? Happily, the Pope at least looks a little bit worried. He apparently has no doubts. Now, I don't know if you're aware that you're from the home of the first Bible riots in the country. The ostensible problem was that Bishop Kenrick asked that Catholic children be allowed to use the Douay-Rheims version of the Bible in their classes. Bible was an essential part of education. And that they be freed to not take religion classes. Now you see, the Protestant mindset said separation of church and state. Of course we're teaching Bible in school. That's not church, because it's not Methodist, or it's not Presbyterian, or Congregationalist, or Baptist. It's just the Bible. It's just what God wants us to know. And the Catholics say, we don't believe the same things about the Bible and the translations. So when the board accepts his idea, and the Board of Controllers of the public schools ordered that no child should be forced to participate in religious activities. Now, you know, they were singing Protestant hymns. Most people here are old enough to remember that that was not acceptable, you know? But from the Protestant side, not having to read the Protestant Bible, they, you know, now I have to explain. In those days they had journalists who would kind of try to rile up the people. They weren't always giving the news absolutely objectively. So you've got to try to imagine this, okay? So the idea comes that the Catholics are trying to remove God from all education. At one point, 94 local Philadelphia clergy claimed that they would strengthen Protestant education and awaken the community to the dangers threatening the United States from the assaults of Romanism. So in 1844, there's a nativist rally. Now, it's a Friday afternoon. I can't imagine how this might have happened. But there's a nativist rally. All the anti-Catholic people are there, and they say some Irish came along. Now, Irish on a Friday afternoon, I would have thought we're getting ready to go in line for confession. But apparently they kind of started a brawl. And then it started to rain. God tried to solve the situation. The rains came. But they went into a market. And there they continued the brawl. And somebody pulled out a gun, and shots were fired, and the first one to die was one of the nativists. So that was on Friday the 3rd. By Tuesday the 7th, they're into round 2 of this rioting, and by May 8th, Wednesday, the nativists burned down St. Michael's Church and Rectory, then St. Augustine's, and they stood around cheering while the steeple fell. Bishop Kenrick closed all of the churches on the next Sunday. Here we have the burnings of the churches. So the Catholic response. Bishop Kenrick posts these flyers, has them posted all around the city. And some people are busy taking them down. He says, "To the Catholics of the city and county of Philadelphia, the melancholy riot of yesterday, which resulted in the death of several of our fellow beings." He doesn't say Protestants, he doesn't say Catholics. Several of our fellow beings, calls for deep sorrow. It becomes all who have had any share in this tragical scene to humble themselves before God and sympathize deeply and sincerely with those whose relatives and friends have fallen. I earnestly conjure all to avoid all occasion of excitement and to shun public places of assemblage and to do nothing that in any way can exasperate. Follow peace with all men and charity, without which no man can see God. So that's Kenrick's first response, trying to calm things down. The official Catholic response, not the Irish guys on the corner. The U.S. in the church in the 1940s, Bishop Kenrick. At this time, there are race riots and anti-Catholic riots in Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Bardstown, Charleston, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New Orleans, and Mobile. They say that the high windows of the cathedral, I've heard this disabused as well, were so that they wouldn't easily be vandalized. Why is there this mutual distrust between the Catholics and the Protestants of the United States? They saw themselves as opposites. The Vatican judged democracy on the basis of their experience of the French Revolution and everything that was happening in Europe on the head of that, which was, as I said earlier, godless, anti-Catholic. The church in Europe, the Catholic Church in Europe, had been so tied to the monarchies that it was hard to attack one without attacking the other. The Catholic side really believed that this is the way God wanted things. The U.S. majority saw religion through the prism of the Reformation, which they saw as a rebellion against corruption and idolatry. They believed that the Catholic Church wanted complete control, that it was a monarchy, which is what they had tried to overthrow and had freed themselves of. They believed that Catholics were loyal to a foreign potentate. Now remember, Protestants had no kind of centralized authority in religion, and the Catholics did. The Europeans were used to classes. They saw Catholic immigration as part of a plot. So here, one of the famous political cartoonists of the day was Thomas Nast. And he's showing bishops looking like alligators coming to eat up the poor school children, taking the Bible away from them. What's happening is the Reformation is living on in the hearts and minds of the people. Now, part of the problem is the way we look at the Bible. Of course, the Protestants, the Bible, sola scriptura, that's how you're saved. We also divide the Ten Commandments differently. I caught this when we were in grad school. Somebody said something about being something against the seventh, all of the sins against the seventh commandment. And I was like, the seventh commandment? Thou shalt not steal. Everybody's uptight about that. Well, then I found out that on the Protestant side, it's adultery. So it's all the sex stuff. What's happened is as they've divided what Moses wrote, the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second is, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow thyself down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. Well, they're talking about our statues. So then the commandments don't go together until what we have as 9 and 10, they conflate into 10. So, their reading of the commandments is actually denigrating Catholics. So there's a school incident. Young Thomas Wall is told to read the commandments from the King James Bible, and he says, the Jesuit priest says we shouldn't do that. And so he goes home and says this, and the priest preaches again about you've got to stand up, you've got to stay true to your faith. So the next time he's told to read, the principal comes in. And when Thomas refuses to read, the principal says, boys, you're going to get taught a lesson. And he starts to beat Thomas's hands for a full half an hour. The kid, they say every time the teacher stopped beating the kid, the boys in the class are going, hang on, Thomas, keep it. And it turns out to be a terrible incident that gets publicized in newspapers throughout the country. Thomas Wall becomes every Catholic kid's hero. The family sues the school, and the judge who doesn't accept their suit says it's because, quote, refusal to recite the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments threatened the stability of the public school, the granite foundation upon which our Republican form of government rests. What were the Catholics to do? Catholic schools. It's the answer to everything except how to pay for it. Bishop Kenrick, 1850, I am fully sensible to the importance of Catholic schools, but I do not know how we are to establish them. Teachers of a religious character are not easily had, and the schoolhouses are wanting. So we get two different approaches to how to deal with this. On the one side, we have happy Bishop Bernard McQuaid. If you've read my book, you'll see I'm not one of his greatest fans. He's the Bishop of Rochester, and he is all for the parish school. Every parish should have a school. He's part of this movement that says, when you're starting a parish, build the school before you build the church, because that's the most important thing. And he's the one who separates the Sisters of St. Joseph of Buffalo, who are in Rochester when it becomes a diocese, and says, you're mine, you can go back to Buffalo, but if you're here, I'm in charge. And he favored the Sisters of St. Joseph of Buffalo to the point that, we have a friend, Sister of Mercy here, he said to the Sisters of Mercy, you will only receive members equal to the number of members who die in that year. They were not to grow. All of the pastors were supposed to encourage people to enter the Sisters of St. Joseph. They were going to be his teachers, his core for a Catholic school system. Mother Agnes Hines was his chosen leader. There's a lot more story there after he got rid of Mother Stanislaus Leary. On the other side is Bishop John Ireland, who picks up a plan that started in Poughkeepsie, New York, which says the Catholic Church has these schools, but it's very hard for us to afford them, and our people aren't paying taxes for public education. Therefore, we suggest that we rent you the school for $1 a year, and that you hire the sisters to teach. They will not teach religion during the day. All religious activities will be before and after the school day. But you're getting a good deal here. And he tried to make that a go. But it was the McQuaid side that really won the day, both because of resistance on the part of the public schools and resistance on the part of a lot of the bishops. So here we go. I mean, this is sort of, we're moving toward the end. They needed teachers, and that need at that time brought a response. All the novitiates looked like that. When you think about it, from 1860 to 1950, the Catholic Church in the United States really built up its own parallel society. Parishes and dioceses had schools, social clubs, religious activities, the Knights of Columbus as your insurance policy, burial societies, everything you needed from womb to tomb. People rarely saw the bishop. They were with the pastor or priests a few hours a week at most. Mass and confession, maybe devotions. Who was the Catholic Church that did this? How many hours were the sisters with the people, with the children? And so, we are the ones who built up the Catholic Church in the United States because we believed that there, in the manifestation of the zeal characteristic of our humble vocation, we should imitate the fervor of the most zealous and embrace in desire and act on behalf of the salvation of the whole world in a spirit replete with true humility and generous courage to suffer everything and undertake everything for the advancement of the glory of God and the salvation of the dear neighbor. So that's just a little overview of our history of building up the Catholic Church in the United States, and I'm going to write a whole book about it. So.